Millie's Diner was the kind of place that felt like home to anyone passing through. Nestled on a quiet stretch of Route 9, it was the perfect pit stop for truckers, families on road trips, and locals who wanted their coffee hot and their eggs just right. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the steady hum of the jukebox in the corner filled the room with soft tunes from decades past. It was Emily Dawson's favorite part of the day, those early morning hours when the diner slowly came alive. The clink of plates, the rustle of newspapers, the polite chatter of regulars who knew her by name, it all gave her a sense of calm and routine. Emily worked the morning shift, her apron tied neatly around her waist, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She moved through the diner with a quiet grace, always attentive but never intrusive. To anyone who saw her, she looked like just another small-town waitress, a young woman in her mid-20s with kind eyes, a soft smile, and an air of modesty. "Morning, Emily," called out Joe, the local mailman, as he settled into his usual booth by the window. "Morning, Joe." "The usual?" Emily asked, her voice warm but calm. "You know it," Joe replied with a grin, folding his hands over the day's newspaper. Emily poured his coffee, the steam rising in soft curls as she set the cup down in front of him. She made small talk, nodding politely as Joe rambled on about the weather and a new family that had moved into town. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, even if she rarely talked about herself. And that was just how she liked it. No one in the diner knew much about Emily Dawson. She had arrived in town a few months ago, quietly taking up the job at Millie's and renting a small apartment above the hardware store. She didn't share stories about her past, and she didn't ask too many questions about anyone else's. Most people figured she was just another young woman trying to find her way in life. But Emily wasn't just trying to find her way. She was hiding. Underscore 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 on. The morning rush had just begun to settle when Emily grabbed a damp cloth and started wiping down the counter. The hum of conversation was soft and steady, punctuated by the occasional clatter of plates or the ding of the kitchen bell. She glanced at the clock. It was just past 9:30. And that's when she heard it. A low, distant rumble, growing louder with each passing second. Emily straightened, her hand still gripping the cloth as the sound became unmistakable, the roar of motorcycles tearing down the highway. The customers turned their heads toward the windows, curiosity flickering in their eyes. The rumble grew louder, closer, until the motorcycles came into view, their sleek, chrome bodies gleaming under the morning sun. 3 of them. They pulled into the gravel parking lot with a screech, the sound of tires kicking up dust loud enough to make a few patrons wince. The engines cut off one by one, and for a brief moment, there was silence. And then, they walked in. The door swung open with a loud creak, and the 3 bikers stepped inside. They were big, broad-shouldered men, their leather jackets worn and covered in patches. Heavy boots thudded against the tiled floor as they made their way to a booth near the back, their presence commanding the room without a single word. The leader of the group was the tallest, his scruffy beard and piercing eyes giving him an air of authority. He scanned the room with a smirk, as if daring anyone to meet his gaze. The second man, stockier with a shaved head, cracked his knuckles loudly, a grin spreading across his face. The third, younger and wiry, followed closely behind, his eyes darting around the diner like he was looking for trouble. Emily didn't flinch. She had seen their type before, men who thrived on intimidation, who fed off the fear they inspired in others. She kept her expression neutral as she walked over to their table, her notepad in hand. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "What can I get you?" The leader leaned back in the booth, spreading his arms along the top of the seat like he owned the place. "We'll start with coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Emily nodded, jotting it down. 3 coffees. Anything else? The stocky one snickered, leaning forward with a sneer. How about some service with a smile? Laughter erupted from the group, loud and mocking. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at Emily to see how she would react. She didn't. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod. Coming right up, she said, turning on her heel and walking back to the counter. As she poured the coffee, the murmurs of the other customers reached her ears. Words like trouble and bad news floated through the air, but Emily ignored them. She carried the tray back to the table, setting the mugs down one by one. Here you go, she said, keeping her tone even. The wiry one grabbed his mug, taking a long sip before slamming it down on the table. Not bad, he said, licking his lips. But I think it could use a little sweetness. Emily's gaze flicked to the sugar dispenser in the center of the table. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving the bikers to their antics. Underscore 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 on. The rest of the diner seemed to hold its breath. Conversations had died down, and even the clatter of dishes in the kitchen had grown quieter. All eyes were on the table in the back, where the bikers laughed and talked loudly, their voices cutting through the tension like a knife. Emily continued her work, clearing plates and refilling coffee cups as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But anyone paying close attention might have noticed the subtle way her shoulders squared or the quiet confidence in her movements. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't scared. She was watching. Because while the bikers thought they were in control, Emily knew better. She had seen men like them before, bullies who underestimated everyone around them. She had learned long ago not to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. And if they pushed too far? Well, she wasn't worried about that, either. For now, though, she kept her head down, her expression unreadable as the bikers continued their show. But what they didn't know, what no one in the diner knew, was that Emily Dawson wasn't just a waitress. She was a fighter. A champion. And if it came down to it, she was more than ready to remind them just how dangerous it was to underestimate her. Underscore 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 on. This setup creates intrigue, introduces Emily's unassuming nature, and builds tension with the arrival of the bikers, all while hinting at her hidden strength. It sets the stage for the unfolding conflict in a way that hooks the audience and keeps them engaged. Millie's Diner was the heart of the town, a haven for locals and travelers alike. Its checkered floors and red vinyl booths had seen decades of stories, some whispered over coffee, others told through the laughter of families. Emily Dawson had been part of this tapestry for only a few months, but she fit right in, blending seamlessly into the routine of the diner. Every morning, she walked in at 6 a.m., tying her apron with practiced ease and flashing a quiet smile at the cook, Jerry, who always greeted her with a "morning, kiddo." By the time the first rays of sunlight spilled through the windows, Emily had already set the tables, brewed the coffee, and prepared the diner for the day's rush. To anyone who saw her, Emily was the epitome of an unassuming waitress, polite, attentive, and always willing to go the extra mile for a customer. But beneath the surface, she was anything but ordinary. It was a crisp spring morning when the roar of motorcycles shattered the usual peaceful atmosphere of Millie's Diner. The regulars, who were midway through their pancakes and coffee, turned toward the windows with varying expressions of curiosity and unease. The noise grew louder, closer, until the motorcycles appeared in the gravel parking lot. 3 of them, sleek and powerful, their chrome glinting under the morning sun. The riders dismounted with practiced ease, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the diner's chatter quieted as the bikers approached. The leader pushed open the door with a heavy hand, letting it swing wide as he strode in. His leather jacket, adorned with patches and insignias, looked worn but imposing. His beard was scruffy, and his eyes held a sharp, calculating glint. Behind him, two others followed. One was stocky, his shaved head glinting under the fluorescent lights. The other was wiry, younger, with a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. Together, they radiated an air of intimidation, the kind that made people instinctively avert their eyes. Emily was wiping down the counter when they walked in. She glanced up briefly, her face betraying nothing. She had seen men like them before, men who thrived on the discomfort of others, who entered rooms as if they owned them. She didn't flinch. The leader scanned the room, his smirk widening as he noticed the hush that had fallen over the diner. He took a step forward, his boots thudding against the tiles, and chose a booth near the back. With a jerk of his chin, he signaled for the others to join him. The stocky one slid into the booth first, cracking his knuckles loudly as if to punctuate the tension. The wiry one followed, his eyes darting around the diner, assessing the patrons with a predator's curiosity. Emily finished wiping the counter and grabbed her notepad. As she approached the booth, the sound of her footsteps seemed louder than usual against the quiet. "Good morning," she said, her tone calm and professional. "What can I get you?" The leader leaned back in his seat, draping one arm across the backrest. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Emily nodded, her pen poised over the notepad. "Anything else?" The stocky one grinned, leaning forward. "How about a smile?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Laughter erupted from the group, loud and jarring in the otherwise silent diner. A few of the other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Emily didn't react. Instead, she nodded once and jotted down the order. "3 coffees," she said. "I'll be right back." Behind the counter, Emily filled the coffee cups with a steady hand. She could feel the weight of the bikers' stares, their laughter still echoing in her ears. The other customers tried to resume their conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted, the usual warmth replaced by a quiet tension. Jerry peeked out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Everything okay out there?" he asked, his voice low. Emily glanced at him and gave a small nod. "It's fine," she said. Jerry hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the booth in the back. He didn't look convinced, but he trusted Emily enough not to press further. Carrying the tray of coffee, Emily returned to the biker's table. She set the mugs down one by one, her movements precise and controlled. "Here you go," she said, her voice steady. The wiry one grabbed his mug, taking a long sip before slamming it back onto the table. "Not bad," he said, his smirk widening. "But I think it could use a little more sweetness." The leader chuckled, leaning forward. "You hear that, sweetheart? My friend here thinks your coffee needs work. What do you say to that?" Emily met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'll bring the sugar," she said simply, turning on her heel and walking away. As Emily reached the counter, she allowed herself a brief moment to exhale. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, her knuckles whitening. But she quickly released it, smoothing out her apron as she grabbed the sugar dispenser. She wasn't rattled, not really. She had dealt with worse than a few loud bikers. But that didn't mean she enjoyed this kind of attention. Setting the sugar dispenser on the tray, Emily caught her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee machine. For a moment, her own eyes stared back at her, calm and calculating. No one in the diner knew the truth about Emily Dawson. To them, she was just the quiet waitress who always showed up on time and never caused a fuss. But if they had known who she really was, what she was capable of, they would have looked at her very differently. As Emily returned to the biker's table, she noticed the way the leader's gaze followed her every movement. He was watching her, assessing her, just as she was assessing him. She set the sugar dispenser down on the table without a word. "There you go," she said, stepping back. The stocky one grabbed it, shaking an unnecessary amount of sugar into his mug. The leader leaned back, smirking as he watched her. "You don't talk much, do you?" he asked. Emily glanced at him, her expression neutral. "Only when I need to," she replied. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "I like you," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "You've got spunk." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate. At the counter, Emily busied herself with refilling the salt and pepper shakers. She kept her hands moving, her mind steady, but she remained acutely aware of the bikers in the corner. They thought they were in control. They thought their size, their voices, and their presence were enough to dominate the room. They had no idea who they were dealing with. For months, Emily had kept her past buried, her life in this small town a carefully constructed facade. But it wasn't just a new start she was seeking, it was a refuge. A chance to live quietly, away from the world she had left behind. But now, as the bikers laughed and jeered, Emily felt the familiar stirrings of something she had tried to suppress. Not fear. Anticipation. The atmosphere in Millie's diner had shifted. What was once a warm and welcoming space filled with the comforting sounds of clinking plates and murmured conversations had turned tense. The arrival of the bikers had created a ripple of unease that was impossible to ignore. Conversations died out, and the regulars focused on their meals, quietly hoping the disruption wouldn't escalate. At their booth in the corner, the three bikers were making no effort to keep a low profile. Their voices boomed, punctuated by bursts of coarse laughter, as they made a spectacle of themselves. The leader, a towering man with a scruffy beard and piercing eyes, sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. He drummed his fingers against the edge of the table, his gaze lazily scanning the room. The stocky one, his bald head shining under the diner's fluorescent lights, leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest as he smirked at anyone who dared to glance in their direction. The wiry one, younger and jittery, seemed unable to sit still, his eyes darting from table to table as if daring someone to challenge him. "Hey, waitress," the leader suddenly barked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. Emily was behind the counter, refilling the salt shakers, when the sharp command reached her. She didn't flinch or pause, instead, she calmly finished what she was doing before turning to face the table. "Coffee," the leader growled, slamming his fist on the counter for emphasis. The sound echoed across the diner, causing several customers to jump. Emily reached for the coffee pot, her movements measured and deliberate. She walked over to their table, her expression calm, and began pouring coffee into the leader's mug. As she poured, the stocky one leaned forward, his grin widening. "You deaf, or are you just slow?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The wiry one chuckled, kicking his feet up onto the empty seat across from him. "Maybe she's scared," he said, his tone teasing. Emily said nothing. Her hand remained steady as she filled the mugs in front of the other two bikers. She set the pot down on the table with a quiet clink, her fingers tightening on the handle for a split second before releasing it. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice cool and polite, betraying nothing of what she might have been feeling. The leader leaned back in his seat, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he drawled. "How about a smile?" The words hung in the air, heavy and taunting. The other two bikers burst into laughter, the sound harsh and grating against the uneasy silence that had fallen over the diner. Emily's lips twitched, not into a smile, but something else. For a moment, she held the leader's gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and walked back to the counter. Behind her, the laughter continued, the bikers clearly enjoying their little game. The other diners kept their heads down, pretending not to notice the tension as they ate their meals in strained silence. Behind the counter, Emily set the coffee pot down with a soft clink. Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter, and for the briefest of moments, her hands curled into fists. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and her hands relaxed again. Jerry, the cook, peeked out from the kitchen, his brow furrowed. "You okay out here?" he asked in a low voice. Emily glanced at him and gave a small nod. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone steady. Jerry didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He knew Emily well enough by now to recognize when she didn't want to talk. As she returned to her tasks, Emily's eyes flicked briefly to the bikers. They were still laughing, their voices carrying across the diner as they leaned back in their seats, clearly enjoying the discomfort they were causing. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't scared. But she was watching. At the booth nearest the door, Joe, the local mailman, sat with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. His eyes darted nervously between the bikers and Emily, his usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "Think she's okay?" he whispered to Linda, the town librarian, who sat across from him. Linda adjusted her glasses, her lips pressing into a thin line. "She seems calm," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. At the counter, an elderly couple exchanged uneasy glances. The man, wearing a plaid shirt and suspenders, leaned toward his wife. "We could step in, maybe say something," he murmured. His wife shook her head, her expression wary. "And make it worse? Let's just stay out of it, Frank." The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet undercurrent of unease that no one dared to address aloud. As Emily wiped down the counter, her movements steady and deliberate, she replayed the bikers' words in her mind. Their taunts, their laughter, it was all so predictable. She had encountered men like them before, loud, arrogant, and entirely too confident in their ability to intimidate others. But what they didn't know, what no one in the diner knew, was that Emily Dawson wasn't someone who could be intimidated. She had spent years honing her skills, pushing her body and mind to their limits. She had faced opponents far more dangerous than three unruly bikers in a small-town diner. And while she had promised herself that this chapter of her life was behind her, she hadn't forgotten a single thing she had learned. For now, though, she kept her composure. There was no need to escalate the situation, not yet. The bikers' antics continued, their voices growing louder as they tried to draw more attention to themselves. The wiry one reached for the sugar dispenser, tipping it over and spilling its contents across the table. "Oops," he said with a grin, not bothering to clean up the mess. The stocky one leaned forward, grabbing a ketchup bottle and squirting a stream onto his plate in an exaggerated motion. "This place could use some entertainment," he said, his voice carrying across the room. The leader chuckled, his eyes flicking toward Emily. "What do you think, sweetheart? Want to put on a little show for us?" The laughter that followed was loud and grating, a deliberate attempt to provoke a reaction. Emily stopped what she was doing and turned to face them. Her expression was calm, her gaze steady. For a moment, the biker's laughter faltered under the weight of her stare. Then, just as quickly, she turned away and walked into the kitchen, leaving them to their antics. Behind the counter, Jerry watched her go, his brow furrowed. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again when she returned. Emily gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm fine," she said softly. But inside, a storm was brewing. Underscore 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 on. The tension in the diner grew thicker with every passing moment. The bikers seemed to thrive on the discomfort they caused, feeding off the uneasy glances and whispered conversations of the other patrons. It wasn't just about the coffee or the food, they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before someone snapped. The leader leaned back in his seat, a self-satisfied grin on his face. He picked up his coffee cup, taking a long sip before grimacing. "Ugh, this tastes like dishwater," he said loudly, slamming the mug back onto the table. The stocky one chuckled. "What do you expect? This ain't exactly a five-star joint." The wiry one snickered, nudging the leader with his elbow. "Maybe the waitress can do better." "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, waving Emily over with exaggerated motions. Emily had just emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray with plates for another table. She paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking toward the bikers before continuing to the booth where a young couple sat, their faces tight with worry. "Here you go," she said softly, setting the plates down with care. The couple murmured their thanks, their voices barely audible. As she straightened up, the leader barked again, "Hey! Don't ignore us, girl. We're paying customers." Emily turned to face them, her expression as calm and composed as ever. She walked over to their table, standing just out of reach, her hands folded in front of her. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The leader leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table as he smirked up at her. "This coffee tastes like garbage," he said. "Think you can brew us something better, or is this the best you've got?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I can make a fresh pot," she said simply. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, don't bother. I think it's the waitress that's the problem, not the coffee." The other two bikers roared with laughter, slapping the table as if the comment was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or sigh. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and unyielding. For a moment, the leader's laughter faltered, his grin fading as he met her eyes. There was something in her stare, something calm yet unshakable. It wasn't anger or fear. It was the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Emily turned and walked back to the counter, her posture as relaxed as ever. The leader frowned, leaning back in his seat. "What's her deal?" he muttered, more to himself than to his companions. The wiry one shrugged, still grinning. "Maybe she's just shy. Or maybe she knows better than to mess with us." The stocky one laughed, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, she probably knows her place." The bikers weren't satisfied with the lack of reaction. They wanted more. They wanted to see her squirm, to prove their dominance. The wiry one reached for the napkin dispenser, yanking it off the table and tossing it onto the floor. "Oops," he said with mock innocence, looking toward Emily. "Hey, waitress. You dropped something." Emily didn't respond. She continued wiping down the counter, her back to the bikers. The stocky one leaned forward, his voice rising. "Hey. She's ignoring us now. That's just plain rude." The leader's smirk returned. "Maybe we need to teach her some manners," he said, his tone laced with menace. At that moment, Jerry stepped out of the kitchen, a spatula in his hand. He glanced at the bikers, his jaw tightening. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The leader turned his attention to Jerry, his grin widening. "Nah, no problem. We're just having a little fun, that's all." Jerry's eyes narrowed. "This is a family diner. We don't tolerate disrespect here." The stocky one snorted. "Oh, come on, old man. We're just playing around. Lighten up." Emily stepped in before Jerry could respond. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. "It's okay, Jerry," she said softly. "I've got this." Jerry hesitated, his eyes searching hers. After a moment, he nodded reluctantly and retreated back to the kitchen, though it was clear he wasn't happy about it. The bikers watched the exchange with amusement, their grins growing wider. To them, it was a sign that they had the upper hand. But Emily knew better. She walked over to their table, picking up the napkin dispenser from the floor and placing it back on the table with quiet precision. "Anything else you need?" she asked, her tone as calm as ever. The leader leaned forward, his smirk turning into a sneer. "Yeah. How about a little respect?" Emily's lips twitched again, not into a smile, but something close. She straightened up, her gaze steady as she looked down at them. "Respect goes both ways," she said simply. The leader blinked, caught off guard by her response. The other two bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading into awkward silence. Emily didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked back to the counter, leaving them to stew in their own confusion. For a moment, the bikers were quiet, their bravado shaken. But it didn't last long. The leader leaned back in his seat, his expression hardening. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered. The wiry one shrugged, his grin returning. "Maybe she thinks she's tough. We'll see about that." The stocky one cracked his knuckles, his grin widening. "Yeah. Let's see how tough she really is." As the bikers plotted their next move, Emily stood behind the counter, her eyes scanning the diner. She took in the worried faces of the other customers, the tense atmosphere that hung over the room. She didn't want to escalate the situation. She didn't want to cause a scene. But if the bikers pushed too far, she was ready. Because what they didn't know, what no one in the diner knew, was that Emily Dawson wasn't just a waitress. She was a champion boxer. And if it came down to it, she was more than capable of handling herself. The stage was set, the tension building with every passing moment. The bikers were pushing their luck, unaware that they were about to cross a line they couldn't come back from. Emily remained calm, her composure unshaken. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for what was to come. And when the moment arrived, they would finally learn the truth. The bikers were like kids in a schoolyard, egging each other on, feeding off one another's antics as they escalated their behavior. The quiet ambience of Millie's diner had long been replaced by the grating sound of crude jokes and jeering laughter. "Hey, sweetheart," the wiry one called out, leaning back in his chair as though he had all the time in the world. "You forgot to refill my coffee. Or do I need to give you a lesson in service?" Emily didn't flinch. She walked to their table with the coffee pot in hand and refilled his cup with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all morning. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone cool and even. The wiry one smirked, leaning in closer. "How about your phone number?" he said, drawing a round of laughter from his companions. Emily didn't reply. She turned and walked away, leaving the bikers to their amusement. But they weren't done. The leader, emboldened by Emily's calm demeanor, grabbed a ketchup bottle from the edge of the table and squeezed it hard, letting a thick red line spill across the tabletop and drip onto the floor. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Looks like someone made a mess." The stocky one slapped the table, howling with laughter. "Yeah, better clean that up, sweetheart," he added, his voice mocking. The other diners looked on in a mix of shock and discomfort. A mother with two young children ushered them closer, whispering for them to finish their food quickly. An older man in the corner shook his head, muttering under his breath about kids these days. But no one intervened. Emily walked back to their table, a rag in hand. She didn't speak as she wiped the mess clean, her movements slow and deliberate. But as she squeezed the rag, there was a faint but audible crack, the sound of the fibers stretching under the pressure of her grip. The leader noticed, his grin widening. "What's the matter, doll? You mad?" he asked, leaning forward to peer into her face. Emily straightened up, locking eyes with him for the first time. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in her gaze, something sharp, something dangerous. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same calm expression she'd worn all day. "I'm fine," she said simply, turning to head back to the counter. Behind the counter, Emily busied herself with organizing sugar packets and napkins, her movements mechanical. But anyone paying attention would have noticed the small details: the slight clench of her jaw, the subtle tightening of her shoulders. Jerry, watching from the kitchen window, frowned. He knew Emily better than most. He'd hired her 6 months ago, and though she didn't talk much about her past, he'd seen the way she carried herself. There was a quiet strength about her, a confidence that didn't come from waiting tables. His eyes drifted to the staff room door, where a faded poster hung on the wall. It showed a younger Emily, gloves raised, her expression fierce and determined. "Golden Gloves champion, Emily Dawson," it read in bold letters. Jerry shook his head, muttering under his breath. They don't know who they're messing with. Back at the biker's table, the stocky one reached for his fork, but it slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He glanced around, then grinned. "Hey, waitress. Mind getting that for me?" Emily walked over, bending down to pick up the fork without complaint. As she rose, the leader's voice cut through the air. "You're too nice," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Bet you're scared of us, huh?" Emily paused, holding the fork in her hand. She looked up, meeting his gaze once more. This time, the flicker in her eyes lingered a little longer, just enough to send a shiver down the spine of anyone perceptive enough to notice. "I'm not scared of you," she said softly, her voice steady. The leader chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Is that right? Well, maybe you should be." The stocky one and the wiry one burst into laughter, slapping their knees as if the leader had just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke. As Emily walked away, the biker's laughter echoed behind her. But they didn't notice the calluses on her knuckles when she set down a fresh stack of plates at the counter. They didn't see the subtle scars along her forearms, hints of battles fought and won. The other diners, too, were oblivious to the small but telling signs. To them, Emily was just a waitress, a quiet, unassuming young woman trying to make a living. But there was one person who noticed. An older man sitting by the window watched her closely, his keen eyes catching every detail. He'd seen those calluses before, on the hands of soldiers and fighters. He'd seen the way she moved, with a precision and control that came from years of discipline. He sipped his coffee, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "They have no idea," he muttered to himself. As the bikers grew louder and bolder, Emily's patience was tested. They knocked over salt shakers, left their plates half-eaten, and called out crude remarks every time she walked by. But through it all, Emily remained composed. She wiped up their messes, refilled their drinks, and responded to their taunts with calm, measured words. Still, something was shifting. Behind her calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Her movements grew sharper, more deliberate. Her gaze lingered a little longer on the bikers each time she passed their table. And then came the final straw. The wiry one, clearly emboldened by their antics, reached out as Emily walked by and grabbed her wrist. "Hey, don't walk away when I'm talking to you," he said, his grin widening. The diner fell silent. All eyes turned to Emily, who stood frozen for a moment. Slowly, she turned her head to look at the wiry one, her expression unreadable. She didn't pull her wrist away. Instead, she stared at him, her gaze steady and unyielding. The wiry one's grin faltered. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he asked, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held just moments before. Emily didn't answer. She didn't have to. The slight tightening of her jaw, the calm but intense look in her eyes, it was enough to make the air in the diner feel heavy. And for the first time, the bikers began to realize that maybe, just maybe, they'd made a mistake. The wiry biker's grip on Emily's wrist was firm but sloppy, a gesture meant to intimidate more than restrain. Yet, Emily didn't yank her arm away. She didn't even flinch. She simply stood there, staring at him with a calmness that was almost unnerving. The diner was so quiet now that the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner could be heard. The wiry biker's companions, sensing the tension, stopped laughing. The leader, sitting with his arms crossed and a cocky smirk on his face, decided to break the silence. "What's the matter, sweetheart? Ain't you got anything to say?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Slowly, she tilted her head to the side, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Let go," she said, her voice firm yet eerily composed. The wiry biker hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually listen to her. But then the leader barked out a laugh. "Oh, come on, Johnny. What's she gonna do? She's just a little waitress." Encouraged by the leader's words, Johnny tightened his grip and leaned in closer. "You're gonna have to ask nicer than that," he sneered, his breath reeking of stale beer. Jerry watched the scene unfold from behind the kitchen window, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. He'd seen enough. Wiping his hands on his apron, he started to push the door open to step in. But something stopped him. It wasn't fear, nor was it hesitation. It was the look on Emily's face. There was no panic, no fear, just a quiet determination that Jerry had seen only once before, on the day she had first started working at the diner. He'd asked her why she'd moved to this small town, and she'd said, "Sometimes, you need to start fresh. But that doesn't mean you forget who you are." He didn't understand what she'd meant back then. But now, as he watched her handle the bikers, the pieces began to fall into place. Emily didn't pull her wrist away. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step closer to Johnny, closing the gap between them. The move was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it shifted the dynamic in the room. The stocky biker, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly sat up straight. The leader's smirk faltered just a bit, though he quickly masked it with a laugh. "You're playing with fire, sweetheart," Johnny warned, though his voice carried less conviction now. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with an undercurrent of something sharper. With a sudden, fluid motion, she twisted her wrist out of his grip. It happened so quickly and smoothly that Johnny barely had time to react. He stumbled back a step, staring at her in shock. "You really shouldn't put your hands on people without their permission," Emily said, her voice steady and clear. The other diners watched in stunned silence. The tension in the room was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Johnny scowled, his face turning red with embarrassment. "You think you're tough, huh?" he spat, straightening up and trying to regain his composure. The leader stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the diner. "All right, that's enough playing around," he said, his voice low and menacing. He glanced at Emily, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself, lady." Emily didn't back down. She stood her ground, her posture relaxed but alert. Her eyes flicked briefly to the other diners, who were now watching with a mix of fear and curiosity. "You should sit down and finish your coffee," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. The stocky biker laughed, a loud, harsh sound that echoed through the diner. "Oh, this is rich. She thinks she can tell us what to do." The leader took a step closer, towering over Emily. "You got a big mouth for someone so small," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. As the bikers loomed over her, Emily's mind drifted for just a moment. She thought of the nights spent in dimly lit gyms, the smell of sweat and leather in the air. She thought of the hours she'd spent training, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion. She thought of the fights she'd won, and the few she'd lost. She had walked away from that life, choosing to leave the ring behind and start over. But the lessons she'd learned, the discipline, the resilience, the strength were still with her. And now, it seemed, they were about to come in handy. The leader reached out, placing a heavy hand on Emily's shoulder. "I think you owe us an apology," he said, his tone mocking. The diners gasped, and Jerry took a step forward, ready to intervene. But before he could say anything, Emily acted. In one swift motion, she shrugged off the leader's hand and stepped back, putting a small but significant distance between them. Her movements were precise, almost calculated, like a fighter sizing up her opponent. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The leader's smirk twisted into a snarl. "You've got a lot of nerve," he growled, balling his hands into fists. The stocky biker and Johnny stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. The three of them formed a loose circle around Emily, their intentions clear. But Emily didn't look scared. If anything, she seemed calmer than she had all morning. The older man by the window leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. He'd seen enough fights in his day to recognize the signs. Emily wasn't just standing her ground, she was preparing. Her stance shifted ever so slightly, her weight balanced evenly between her feet. Her hands, which had been hanging loosely at her sides, were now subtly raised, her fingers curling just enough to hint at clenched fists. The older man smiled to himself. "They're in for a surprise," he muttered. The diner felt like a powder keg, moments away from exploding. The bikers, still oblivious to the danger they were in, closed in on Emily, their jeers and taunts growing louder. The other diners held their breath, their eyes darting between Emily and the bikers. Jerry, standing just behind the counter, clenched his fists, torn between stepping in and letting Emily handle it. And Emily, standing at the center of it all, remained calm. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply waited, her eyes fixed on the leader. It was a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. And as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that Emily wasn't the one who should be worried. The leader loomed over Emily, his frame a shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the diner's buzzing fluorescent bulbs. His sneer was pure arrogance, his posture a challenge. "You've got a real attitude, don't ya?" he growled, stepping even closer, his boots echoing ominously on the tile floor. The air was thick with tension. Every pair of eyes in the diner was locked on the unfolding scene, breaths held, waiting to see what Emily would do next. Emily, however, didn't flinch. She didn't step back. If anything, her calm demeanor seemed to sharpen. Her gaze met his, unwavering and steady, her posture loose yet coiled, like a spring ready to snap. "You don't want to do this," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that sent a chill rippling through the room. The leader laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "And what are you gonna do about it, huh?" His hand twitched as if ready to grab her, his smirk widening as he leaned closer. No one saw it coming. Emily moved, swift and precise, a blur of motion that seemed to defy the natural order of things. Before the leader could react, her fist shot out in a tight, practiced arc, slamming into his chest. The impact wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration. The leader staggered back, his face twisted in a mix of shock and pain as he collided with the table. Plates and coffee mugs clattered to the ground, shattering loudly, and the force of the blow left him gasping for air. The diner erupted in gasps, the sound a chorus of disbelief. The second biker, stocky and bull-headed, let out a roar of rage. He lunged at Emily, his arms wide, aiming to tackle her. But Emily was faster. With a sharp pivot, she sidestepped his charge, her movements smooth and controlled, like a fighter in the ring. Before he could recover, she grabbed his arm, twisting it in a motion that looked almost effortless. In one fluid motion, she flipped him over her shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. The floor trembled under the weight of his fall, and a tray of silverware clattered noisily as it was knocked over. The stocky biker groaned, clutching his arm, too stunned to move. The third biker, wiry and jittery, froze in his tracks. His eyes darted between Emily and his fallen companions, his hands trembling slightly. Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she grabbed a napkin from a nearby table and wiped her hands with a deliberate calmness. "You still want that smile?" she asked, her voice cool and razor-sharp. The wiry biker stumbled back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The leader groaned as he struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs. His cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by confusion and fear. "Who the hell are you?" he wheezed, his voice shaking. Emily took a step closer, her movements measured and purposeful. She leaned in slightly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I'm the undefeated regional boxing champion," she said, each word dripping with quiet menace. "And you just picked the wrong diner." The leader's eyes widened as the weight of her words sank in. The realization hit him like a freight train: this wasn't just some small-town waitress. The older man by the window let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, leaning back in his seat with a grin. The other diners erupted into murmurs, their voices a mix of awe and amazement. Jerry, standing behind the counter, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I knew she was tough, but that was something else," he said to himself, a mixture of pride and astonishment in his tone. Emily stood tall, her posture relaxed but commanding. She looked around the diner, her eyes briefly meeting those of the customers who had been watching the ordeal. "You all okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost casual. The diners nodded quickly, their expressions still wide-eyed. The stocky biker groaned as he slowly sat up, his face twisted in pain. "You didn't say she was some kind of freakin' ninja," he muttered to the leader, who was still clutching his ribs. The wiry biker, still frozen in place, suddenly dropped the ketchup bottle he'd been holding. The loud clang as it hit the floor snapped him out of his stupor. Weary sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking. "We didn't mean nothin' by it, honest." Emily crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You can apologize by paying for the damage," she said, her tone firm. "And then you can leave." The leader opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a wad of cash, and tossed it onto the counter. "We're leaving," he muttered, motioning for his companions to follow. The three bikers shuffled out of the diner, their bravado shattered. The sound of their motorcycles roaring to life outside was almost drowned out by the collective exhale of relief from the diners. As the door swung shut behind the bikers, the tension in the diner evaporated like morning mist. The customers slowly returned to their meals, their conversations a buzz of excited whispers about what they had just witnessed. Jerry stepped out from behind the counter, a proud grin on his face. "Remind me never to mess with you," he joked, handing Emily a glass of water. Emily smirked, taking the glass and sipping it slowly. "I told them they didn't want to do this," she said, her voice light but carrying an edge of amusement. The older man by the window raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. "You handled that like a pro," he said, his tone filled with admiration. Emily chuckled softly. "Old habits die hard," she replied, glancing at the shattered plates and scattered silverware. "Guess I'll have to work a little overtime to clean this up." Jerry shook his head. "Don't worry about it. You've already done more than enough for today." As the diner settled back into its usual rhythm, Emily slipped into the staff room for a moment of quiet. She glanced at the boxing poster hanging on the wall, the image of her younger self staring back at her. She had left that life behind for a reason, but today had reminded her of something important: strength wasn't just about what you could do with your fists. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Smiling to herself, Emily returned to the diner, ready to finish her shift. After all, the day wasn't over yet. The tension in the diner was palpable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emily adjusted her apron, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the chaos she had just unleashed. Her movements were precise, calculated just like in the ring. The wiry biker, still trembling, slowly backed away toward the door. Maybe we should just go," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The leader shot him a glare, even as he winced from the pain in his ribs. "We don't run," he hissed, trying to summon the bravado that had just been shattered. But even he knew the situation had spiraled out of his control. Emily tilted her head, observing him like a predator deciding whether to pounce. Her stance was relaxed, but her presence radiated authority. "Running's probably the smartest thing you'll do today," she said, her tone light but laced with steel. The leader hesitated, glancing around the diner as if searching for an escape that didn't involve humiliation. But the other diners were no longer passive spectators, they were witnesses, eyes narrowed, silently daring him to make another move. For a moment, it seemed like he might try again. His hand twitched, and he shifted his weight forward, testing her resolve. But then Emily took a single step closer, and something in her gaze stopped him cold. "Last chance," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Walk out, or we finish this." The leader swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance now a distant memory. He raised his hands slowly, palms out. "We're done here," he muttered, his tone defeated. He turned toward the door, motioning for his companions to follow. The stocky biker groaned as he struggled to his feet, still clutching his arm. The wiry one moved quickly, almost tripping over his own feet in his rush to leave. The leader paused at the threshold, looking back at Emily one last time. His eyes flicked to the boxing poster visible through the staff room door, and realization dawned. "You're her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't reply. She simply held his gaze until he turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him with a final clang. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the room came alive again. The older man at the window let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, that's a story I'll be telling for years," he said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. A younger couple near the counter exchanged wide-eyed glances, their hands still clutching their half-empty mugs. "Did you see that?" the man whispered to his companion. "She took them down like it was nothing." Jerry emerged from behind the counter, his face a mixture of pride and astonishment. "Emily, remind me to give you a raise," he said, his voice light but sincere. Emily allowed herself a small smile. "Just doing my job," she replied, though the glint in her eye suggested she found the situation as amusing as they did. As the adrenaline faded, Emily surveyed the damage. The overturned tables, shattered plates, and spilled drinks painted a picture of chaos. But it was nothing that couldn't be cleaned up. She grabbed a broom and began sweeping, her movements steady and unhurried. Jerry joined her, handing her a dustpan. "You know," he said, his tone conversational, "I always knew there was something different about you. But I didn't think I'd see that." Emily chuckled softly. "Guess I've been keeping a few secrets," she admitted. Jerry raised an eyebrow. "A few? Emily, you just wiped the floor with 3 guys twice your size." She shrugged, her smile faint but genuine. "Old habits die hard." As they worked, the other diners began to pitch in. The older man at the window helped set a table upright, while the younger couple gathered scattered utensils. It was a small act of solidarity, a way to show their appreciation without words. When the diner was mostly back in order, Emily took a moment to herself. She stepped into the staff room, letting the door swing shut behind her. The boxing poster on the wall caught her eye. It was faded and slightly torn at the edges, but the image of her younger self still radiated confidence and determination. She traced a finger along the edge of the poster, memories flooding back. She hadn't stepped into a ring in years, but the lessons she'd learned there had never left her. Strength wasn't just about muscles or speed, it was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It was about standing up for yourself and others, even when it wasn't easy. She glanced at her reflection in the small mirror next to the poster. Her knuckles were red, but she felt no pain. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction, a reminder that she was still that same fighter, even if her life had taken a different path. When Emily returned to the diner, the atmosphere was lighter. The customers had settled back into their meals, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Jerry handed her a fresh apron, his grin as wide as ever. "You sure know how to liven up a shift," he joked. Emily laughed softly, tying the apron around her waist. "Just another day at Millie's," she replied. The older man at the window waved her over. "You ever think about getting back in the ring?" he asked, his tone curious. Emily shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not," she said. "I like it here. Besides, I think I proved my point." The man chuckled, raising his coffee cup again. "That you have, miss. That you have." As Emily returned to her work, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the diner once more. The incident with the bikers became just another story, one that would be told and retold by those who had witnessed it. But for Emily, it was a reminder of who she was and what she stood for. And as she wiped down the counter, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't need a ring to prove her strength, it was already written in every step she took and every choice she made. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving behind a stunned silence in the diner. Slowly, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over the room. Emily stood in the center, as calm as ever, her apron slightly askew but otherwise unruffled. Her gaze lingered on the door for a moment, as if to ensure the bikers were truly gone, before she turned back to her work with practiced ease. It was Jerry who broke the silence first. "Well," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "that was something else." He glanced around at the scattered plates, overturned chairs, and the few remaining ketchup stains on the floor. "You all right, Emily?" Emily nodded, rolling her shoulders as if brushing off the tension. "I'm fine," she said simply. She reached for the broom, her movements unhurried and precise. But the rest of the diner wasn't ready to move on so quickly. "That was incredible," the older man at the window exclaimed, his voice filled with admiration. "I mean, I've seen my share of bar fights, but you didn't just defend yourself, you took them down like a pro." Emily smiled faintly as she began sweeping the shards of a broken coffee cup into a neat pile. "Just a little self-defense," she replied modestly. "Self-defense," one of the younger women near the counter repeated, wide-eyed. "That looked like something out of a movie. How did you do that?" Jerry stepped closer, his expression somewhere between awe and curiosity. "All right, Emily, spill it," he said, crossing his arms. "You've been working here for months, and not once did you mention you could take down 3 guys like it was nothing. What's your secret?" Emily straightened, resting the broom against the counter. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating how much to share. Finally, she gestured toward the staff room door, where the faded boxing poster still hung in plain view. Jerry squinted at the poster, and then his eyes widened. "Wait a minute. That's you." Emily gave a small nod, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "The undefeated regional champion," Jerry murmured, reading the words aloud. "You've got to be kidding me. All this time, and I never knew." The other customers began to murmur among themselves, their amazement growing as they pieced together the truth. "No wonder she didn't back down," someone said. "She's not just tough, she's a professional," another added. Meanwhile, Outside the diner, the bikers weren't faring so well. The leader sat on his motorcycle, nursing his bruised ribs, while the wiry one rummaged through a backpack for a first aid kit. "This is your fault," the stocky biker grumbled, glaring at the leader as he dabbed at a cut on his forehead. "My fault," the leader snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "How was I supposed to know she's a boxer?" "She looks like," he trailed off, realizing how foolish his assumptions had been. "Yeah, and now we look like idiots," the wiry biker muttered, shaking his head. The leader fell silent, his gaze drifting back to the diner. Through the window, he could see the customers laughing and talking, their fear replaced with admiration for the waitress they had underestimated. It was a humbling sight, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely ashamed. "We're not coming back here," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Agreed," the other two muttered in unison. Back inside, Emily had finished cleaning up and was refilling coffee cups as if nothing unusual had happened. But the way the customers looked at her had changed. Where there had once been polite indifference, there was now genuine respect. The younger couple near the counter smiled at her as she approached. "You're amazing," the woman said. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stand up to guys like that before." Emily shrugged lightly. "They were just bullies," she said. "And bullies only have power if you let them." The older man at the window chuckled. "You've got a point there. Still, it's nice to know someone around here's got our backs." Jerry stepped forward, clapping his hands together. "All right, folks, let's give Emily a round of applause," he announced, grinning from ear to ear. The room erupted into cheers and clapping, and though Emily tried to wave it off, there was no hiding the faint blush that crept into her cheeks. Later that evening, after the last customer had left and the diner was locked up for the night, Emily sat at the counter, nursing a cup of tea. Jerry joined her, sliding into the seat next to hers. "You know," he began, "I've always believed everyone's got a story. But yours? Yours takes the cake." Emily smiled, her fingers wrapping around the warm mug. "It's just a part of who I am," she said. "I don't like violence, but sometimes you have to stand up for yourself and for others." Jerry nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I can tell you this much, you've earned yourself a lot of fans today. Myself included." Emily chuckled softly. "Thanks, Jerry." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the diner's refrigerator the only sound. The next morning, Emily returned to work as usual, her apron tied neatly around her waist. But the atmosphere in the diner felt different, lighter, more welcoming. Customers greeted her warmly, some even going out of their way to thank her for what she had done. The younger couple left a generous tip with a note scribbled on the back of their receipt, "You're an inspiration. Thank you for being you." Even Jerry seemed more cheerful than usual, whistling as he flipped pancakes on the griddle. As for Emily, she took it all in stride. She wasn't one for the spotlight, but she appreciated the sense of community that had blossomed in the wake of the incident. And though she hoped she'd never have to use her skills again, she felt a quiet confidence knowing that if the need arose, she could and would stand her ground. The story of the bikers' defeat quickly spread through the small town, becoming a local legend. People who had never set foot in Millie's diner now stopped by, curious to meet the waitress who had taken down 3 grown men with nothing but her fists and her resolve. But for Emily, life went on as usual. She served coffee, cleaned tables, and chatted with customers, content in the knowledge that she had made a difference not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed her stand up to injustice. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room turns out to be the strongest. And those who underestimate them, well, they never see it coming. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the small-town diner in a warm, golden glow. Millie's Diner, an unassuming spot on Route 9, would have seemed just like any other roadside eatery to a passerby. But to those who had been inside that day, it now carried a deeper meaning. For years, Emily had worked quietly, going about her duties with a steady grace that never drew attention. She was the kind of person who blended into the background, the sort people barely noticed as they rushed through their lives. But that day, the quiet waitress had shown the world and perhaps even herself what it truly meant to be strong. Life is full of surprises. Sometimes, the strongest people are not the ones who boast about their power or flaunt their skills. They are the ones who endure, who observe, who quietly handle what life throws at them without demanding recognition. They are the Emilys of the world, individuals who seem ordinary but carry extraordinary strength within. Emily's story wasn't just about standing up to bullies. It was about defying expectations and proving that strength doesn't always look the way we think it does. It's not about size or loudness, it's about character, resilience, and the ability to act when it truly matters. The bikers who stormed into Millie's diner that morning had come with arrogance in their hearts and disrespect in their actions. They saw a petite waitress and assumed she would cower before them. They didn't look beyond her apron or the quiet confidence in her eyes. But the world has a way of humbling those who judge too quickly. When the leader of the bikers stood over Emily, barking insults and trying to intimidate her, he had no idea he was staring down a champion. He didn't know the hours of grueling training she had endured, the matches she had fought, or the resilience she had built over years of discipline and dedication. He didn't see the fighter behind the smile. And that's the lesson for all of us: never underestimate anyone. The quietest person in the room might just be the strongest. Emily's actions also challenged the way people in the diner and perhaps those watching from the outside viewed strength. It wasn't just about her ability to throw a punch or take down 3 men. It was about her composure, her restraint, and her refusal to let their behavior shake her sense of self. Strength is as much about patience as it is about action. It's about choosing when to act and when to hold back, about standing firm in the face of disrespect without losing who you are. Emily didn't respond to the bikers' taunts with anger or cruelty. She waited until the moment demanded action, and when it did, she responded decisively and with purpose. That's a kind of strength that inspires not just admiration, but reflection. For the customers who had watched the scene unfold, the lesson was clear. The older man who had initially dismissed Emily as just another waitress now saw her in a new light. He thought about how many times he had underestimated others in his life, judging them by appearances rather than their true abilities. The young woman at the counter, who had struggled with her own self-confidence, left the diner feeling empowered. If Emily could stand up to 3 intimidating men with nothing but her skill and courage, maybe she could find the strength to face her own challenges. And Jerry, the cook who had always seen Emily as dependable but unremarkable, now realized that people are like books, you can't judge them by their covers. Emily's story didn't just end with the bikers fleeing the diner. It became a tale shared in conversations across town, a reminder of what it means to be strong in a world that often values appearances over substance. For Emily, though, life returned to normal. She wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She didn't need the world to know about her championship titles or her ability to defend herself. She was content with the knowledge that she had done the right thing, that she had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone in the diner who had felt powerless in the face of disrespect. The incident at Millie's diner serves as a timeless reminder: strength comes in many forms. It can be loud or quiet, visible or hidden. And often, the most profound strength lies in those who don't feel the need to show it. Emily's quiet resilience and decisive action taught everyone who witnessed her that day to look beyond the surface. It's a lesson that applies to all of us, in every corner of life. Whether it's the shy co-worker at the office, the soft-spoken neighbor down the street, or the unassuming waitress at your favorite diner, you never truly know the battles someone has fought or the strength they carry within. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Emily's stand became something of a legend in the small town. New customers visited Millie's diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had taught the bikers a lesson they wouldn't forget. But Emily didn't see herself as a hero. To her, it was just another day, another reminder that you don't need to shout to be heard or fight to prove your worth. And perhaps that's the most inspiring takeaway of all: true strength isn't about dominance or aggression. It's about knowing who you are, standing up for what's right, and never letting the world dictate your worth. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones you least expect. And those who underestimate them, they're the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons.